The courthouse clock ticked relentlessly forward as Judge Harold Pierce straightened his robes one final time. His weathered face, once considered handsome in his youth, now bore deep lines of authority and conviction. Through the window, he could see the execution platform that had been prepared in the courthouse square, a somber reminder of what was to come. The crowd had already gathered, their murmurs rising like a tide against the stone walls. "It's time, Your Honor," said Isabella, his clerk, her voice barely above a whisper. Judge Pierce nodded solemnly. In his many years presiding over this district court, he had never wavered in his dedication to justice. His reputation was built on steadfast adherence to the law, uncompromising and severe when necessary. Today would be no different. "Let's proceed," he said, gathering the final execution order from his desk. The condemned man, Patrick Evanston, had been found guilty of murdering Emma Richardson, the beloved daughter of the town's most prominent family. The evidence had been circumstantial but compelling. Patrick's knife found at the scene, his repeated conflicts with the victim documented by multiple witnesses, his lack of a convincing alibi for the night in question. The trial had been swift, the verdict unanimous, and now, after exhausting all appeals, the day of reckoning had arrived. As Judge Pierce made his way through the courthouse corridors, the hushed conversations ceased. People pressed themselves against the walls, some averting their eyes, others watching with solemn curiosity. The judge had always commanded respect, but today, as the orchestrator of a man's final moments, he carried an almost mythical weight. Outside, the execution platform stood starkly against the autumn sky. Patrick Evanston was already there, his hands bound, his face a mask of resigned acceptance. Next to him stood Sheriff Jackson, a man whose broad shoulders and stern demeanor seemed perfectly suited to his role in the day's grim proceedings. The crowd had grown larger, their collective breath creating a fog in the crisp morning air. Judge Pierce ascended the steps, each footfall echoing across the suddenly silent square. He took his position and unfolded the official document. "Patrick James Evanston," he began, his voice carrying across the crowd with practiced authority, "you have been found guilty of the murder of Emma Richardson. You have exhausted all appeals afforded to you by law. The sentence of this court is death by hanging, to be carried out immediately." Patrick's eyes, a startling shade of blue, met the judge's without flinching. There was something in that gaze, not defiance, not fear, but something else, something that, for a brief moment, made Judge Pierce uncomfortable. "Do you have any final words?" the judge asked, following the protocol that had been established long before his time on the bench. Patrick opened his mouth to speak, but at that precise moment, a commotion erupted at the edge of the crowd. People turned, their attention drawn to a small girl pushing her way forward. In her arms was a covered cage, and from within came sounds that didn't belong in the solemn atmosphere of an execution. "Stop!" the girl cried out, her voice piercing through the murmurs of the crowd. "You can't do this! Rosie knows the truth!" Sheriff Jackson moved to intercept her, but Judge Pierce raised his hand, curiosity momentarily overriding procedure. The girl couldn't have been more than 10 or 11, her eyes wide with desperation, her cheeks flushed from exertion. "Young lady, this is a legal proceeding," Judge Pierce said sternly. "You must please just listen to Rosie," the girl pleaded, placing the cage on the ground and removing the cover. Inside was a parrot with vibrant red and blue feathers. The bird cocked its head, beady eyes scanning the crowd before settling on Patrick. Then, to the astonishment of everyone present, it began to speak. "Help Emma! No, stop! Red jacket, knife, blood." The parrot's voice was unnervingly clear, its words sending a ripple of shock through the assembled crowd. "Not Patrick. Red jacket man hurt Emma." The square fell into stunned silence. Judge Pierce stared at the bird, then at the girl, his judicial composure momentarily shattered. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, though his voice lacked its usual authority. The girl, trembling slightly under the weight of all eyes upon her, stepped forward. "My name is Victor Thompson," she said. "I live next door to where Emma was and is where it happened. Rosie was Emma's parrot. Emma would let Rosie sit by the window every day. The night she died, Rosie was there. She saw everything." Patrick, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. "I tried to tell you during the trial. I said someone else was there, someone with a red jacket. No one believed me." Judge Pierce frowned. It was true. Patrick had maintained throughout the trial that he had discovered Emma's body, but had not killed her. He claimed he had seen someone fleeing the scene, someone in a red jacket, but with no other witnesses and the murder weapon bearing his fingerprints, his testimony had been dismissed as a desperate lie. "A parrot cannot testify in court," Judge Pierce said, though doubt had crept into his voice. "This is unprecedented." "But what if she's telling the truth?" Rachel persisted. "What if Rosie really did see something?" The crowd began to murmur again, the mood shifting from somber acceptance to confused uncertainty. Sheriff Jackson looked to the judge for guidance, his hand still resting on the lever that would open the trapdoor beneath Patrick's feet. Judge Pierce found himself at a crossroads. His entire career had been built on following the law to the letter, on maintaining order and upholding the system of justice he had sworn to serve. But standing there with a man's life hanging in the balance and a parrot potentially holding the key to the truth, he felt the foundations of that system trembling beneath him. "Your Honor," Isabella called from the edge of the platform, her face pale. "There's something else you should know." She hurried up the steps and whispered something in the judge's ear. His eyes widened, and for the first time in his career, Judge Pierce felt a cold fear grip his heart. "This execution is temporarily stayed," he announced, his voice cutting through the growing noise of the crowd. "Sheriff, secure the prisoner. Everyone else, clear the square. Court will reconvene in 1 hour." As the crowd reluctantly dispersed, Judge Pierce descended the platform, his mind racing. Isabella had just informed him that new evidence had been discovered. A witness had come forward claiming to have seen someone in a red jacket leaving Emma's home around the time of the murder. Someone who was not Patrick Evanston. And there was more. The witness had described the man in detail, right down to a distinctive scar on his face. A scar that matched one belonging to Robert Richardson, Emma's own brother. Judge Pierce had known Robert for years. The young man had sat stoically through his sister's murder trial, had publicly called for justice, had even addressed the court with a moving victim impact statement. The idea that he could be involved was almost inconceivable. Almost. There had been whispers about tensions between the siblings, rumors of a disputed inheritance, suggestions that Robert's grief might not be entirely genuine. Judge Pierce had dismissed them as the inevitable gossip that surrounds any tragedy. But now, with Patrick's life on the line and a parrot of all things raising questions about the verdict, he couldn't afford to ignore any possibility. He entered the courthouse, his thoughts in turmoil. In his chambers, he found Rachel and Rosie waiting along with Isabella and Sheriff Jackson. "Tell me everything," he said to Rachel, setting aside his judicial distance in the face of this extraordinary situation. "From the beginning." Rachel stroked Rosie's feathers gently. "Emma got Rosie years ago," she began. "She trained her really well. Rosie can repeat whole conversations she hears. Emma would joke that she could never keep secrets with Rosie around." "And she was in the room when Emma was killed?" Judge Pierce asked. Rachel nodded. "Emma always kept Rosie's cage by the window. I think Rosie saw everything." As if to confirm this, the parrot suddenly became agitated, fluttering her wings and repeating the same phrases. "Red jacket. Stop. No, Robert, no." Judge Pierce felt a chill run down his spine at the sound of Robert's name coming from the bird's beak. But he was still a judge, and evidence, especially evidence from such an unusual source, needed to be corroborated. "Isabella," he said, turning to his clerk, "where is this new witness? I need to speak with them immediately." "He's waiting in conference room B," Isabella replied. "His name is Oliver Norton. He's a delivery man who was in the area that night." "And Robert Richardson?" Judge Pierce asked. "Where is he now?" "At his home, as far as we know," Sheriff Jackson answered. "Should I bring him in?" The judge considered this. If Robert was indeed involved in his sister's murder, alerting him now might cause him to flee. But they couldn't delay too long. An innocent man's life was at stake. "Not yet," Judge Pierce decided. "First, I want to hear what Mr. Norton has to say. Then we'll decide our next steps." As he left his chambers, Judge Pierce caught sight of his reflection in a window. The face that looked back at him was no longer that of the confident, unbending arbiter of justice he had always prided himself on being. It was the face of a man confronting the possibility that he had nearly sent an innocent man to his death, and that the real killer might be someone he had comforted, someone he had believed. The weight of that realization settled on his shoulders like a physical burden. For the first time in his career, Judge Harold Pierce questioned not just a verdict, but the very system he had devoted his life to upholding. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered a terrifying question. How many other times might he have been wrong? Oliver Norton's testimony was concise and troubling. He had been delivering a package to a neighboring house on the night of the murder. As he returned to his vehicle, he had seen a man exiting Emma's home, moving quickly, his features partially concealed by the upturned collar of a distinctive red jacket. The man had a visible scar on his cheek, a detail Oliver recalled clearly because it caught the streetlight as the man passed beneath it. "I didn't come forward earlier because I was scared," Oliver admitted, his fingers nervously tapping on the conference table. "The Richardsons are powerful in this town, and when they arrested Patrick so quickly, I thought maybe I was mistaken about what I saw." "What made you change your mind?" Judge Pierce asked. "I saw the execution being set up this morning," Oliver said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent and an innocent man died." Judge Pierce nodded, his expression grave. "Thank you for your courage, Mr. Norton. Your testimony will be formally recorded, and I must ask you to remain available for further questioning." As Oliver left, Sheriff Jackson entered the room, his face tight with tension. "Judge, we have a situation. Robert Richardson is missing. His housekeeper says he left suddenly this morning, taking a bag with him. She overheard him making arrangements to cross the state line." The pieces were falling into place with alarming speed. Judge Pierce made a swift decision. "Issue an alert for Robert Richardson," he ordered. "I want him found and brought in for questioning. And bring Patrick Evanston to my chambers immediately." Within 20 minutes, Patrick stood before the judge, his hands still bound, his face showing the first glimmers of hope since his arrest. "Mr. Evanston," Judge Pierce began, "new evidence has come to light that casts significant doubt on your conviction. I am not yet declaring you innocent, but I am officially staying your execution pending a full reinvestigation of Emma Richardson's murder." Patrick's knees nearly buckled with relief. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't kill her. I've been telling the truth all along." "There will be a formal hearing," Judge Pierce continued. "But for now your sentence is suspended." He turned to Sheriff Jackson. "Remove his restraints and place him under house arrest. He is not to leave town under any circumstances." As the sheriff led Patrick away, Judge Pierce sat heavily in his chair, the events of the day washing over him. A man had come within minutes of being executed for a crime he might not have committed. A parrot, a bird, had disrupted proceedings with what could potentially be key evidence. And now the victim's brother was fleeing, his actions suggesting a guilt that no one had suspected. The system had nearly failed in the most irrevocable way possible. Isabella entered the room, her expression solemn. "The media is outside," she said. "They've caught wind of what's happening, and the Richardson parents are demanding to speak with you." Judge Pierce rose to his feet. This day was far from over, and the most difficult conversations lay ahead. How does one tell parents that their surviving child might have murdered their daughter? How does a judge admit that he had nearly authorized the execution of an innocent man? As he prepared to face these challenges, Judge Pierce thought of Rosie the parrot, an unexpected harbinger of truth in a system that prided itself on finding it. Sometimes it seemed justice needed more than human witnesses and circumstantial evidence. Sometimes it needed a different perspective entirely, even if that perspective came from a creature that could only repeat what it had heard. The truth was out there, fluttering on red and blue wings, squawking to be heard. And Judge Harold Pierce was finally ready to listen. The Richardson estate stood on the highest hill in town, its manicured lawns and imposing architecture a testament to generations of wealth and influence. As Judge Pierce's car crunched up the gravel driveway, he could see Martha and George Richardson waiting on the front steps, their postures rigid with anger and confusion. "You have some explaining to do, Harold," George said, as soon as the judge stepped out of his vehicle. His voice, usually controlled and diplomatic, now held a dangerous edge. "Perhaps we should speak inside," Judge Pierce suggested, conscious of the household staff watching from windows. Martha led them to George's study, a wood-panelled room lined with leather-bound books and hunting trophies. Once the door closed behind them, she rounded on the judge. "How dare you?" she hissed. "How dare you halt the execution of the monster who killed our daughter?" Judge Pierce took a deep breath. "Martha, George, please sit down. What I have to tell you isn't easy to hear." Reluctantly, they took seats on a leather sofa, while Judge Pierce remained standing, feeling that what he was about to say shouldn't be delivered from a position of comfort. "New evidence has emerged," he began carefully. "Evidence that suggests Patrick Evanston may not be guilty of Emma's murder." "What evidence could possibly override a jury's verdict?" George demanded. Judge Pierce hesitated, knowing how it would sound. "A witness has come forward who saw someone leaving your home the night of the murder, someone wearing a red jacket with a scar on his face." The color drained from Martha's face. "You can't mean—" "Robert," George whispered, his voice hollow. "You're talking about Robert." "I'm afraid so," Judge Pierce confirmed, "and there's more. Emma's parrot, Rosie, was in the room during the attack. She has been repeating phrases that strongly implicate Robert." Martha surged to her feet. "This is absurd. A bird. You're listening to a bird over a court of law." "The bird's vocalizations align with the new witness testimony," Judge Pierce replied steadily. "And Robert's sudden departure this morning raises further questions." George's shoulders slumped, the fight seeming to drain out of him. He said he was going to visit college friends, that he needed space because of the execution. "Did Emma and Robert have conflicts?" Judge Pierce asked gently. "Anything that might suggest a motive?" Martha opened her mouth to deny it, but George placed a restraining hand on her arm. "Tell him, Martha," he said quietly. "We can't hide it anymore." Martha sank back onto the sofa, her composure cracking for the first time. "They had been arguing about the family business," she admitted. "Emma was father's favorite. He left her controlling interest in the company, with instructions that she should take over as CEO when she turned 25. Robert was resentful." "Resentful enough to kill?" Judge Pierce asked. "No," Martha insisted. "He was angry, yes, but he would never harm Emma. There must be another explanation." George reached into his pocket and withdrew his phone. "I'll try calling him again." As he dialed, Judge Pierce considered the complex dynamics at play. The Richardsons were not just a family. They were an institution in this town. The idea that their son might be a murderer would be devastating not only personally, but also to their standing in the community. George lowered the phone, his expression grim. Still no answer. "Sheriff Jackson has issued an alert for Robert," Judge Pierce informed them. "If he crosses state lines, he'll be detained." Martha's composure finally broke completely, tears streaming down her face. "This can't be happening," she sobbed. "First Emma, and now you're hunting Robert like a criminal?" Judge Pierce knelt before her, setting aside his judicial distance. "Martha, I know how painful this is, but I need you to understand something. An innocent man nearly died today. Whatever the truth is about Emma's death, we need to find it." "And if that truth destroys what's left of our family?" she asked bitterly. "Then at least it will be the truth," Judge Pierce replied. As he left the Richardson estate, Judge Pierce felt the weight of the day's revelations bearing down on him. He had been so certain of Patrick's guilt, so confident in the system's ability to deliver justice. Now everything he thought he knew had been called into question. His phone rang as he reached his car. It was Sheriff Jackson. "We've got him, Judge." The sheriff's voice crackled through the speaker. "State troopers picked up Robert Richardson at a gas station just shy of the border. They're bringing him back now." "Any statement from him?" Judge Pierce asked. "Nothing coherent," Jackson replied. "He's been demanding his lawyer and ranting about family betrayal. One thing's clear, he's terrified." "Set up the interrogation room," Judge Pierce instructed. "I want to be there when you question him." Meanwhile, across town, Rachel sat cross-legged on the floor of Judge Pierce's chambers, Rosie's cage open beside her. The parrot had hopped onto the arm of a nearby chair, her head swiveling as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. Isabella watched them both, still processing the extraordinary turn of events. "How did you know to bring Rosie to the execution?" she asked. Rachel stroked the parrot's vibrant feathers. "I've been taking care of her since Emma died. The Richardsons didn't want her. They said she reminded them too much of Emma. But lately, whenever I mention Patrick's name, Rosie gets agitated and starts saying those things about the red jacket and Robert. When I heard the execution was today, I knew I had to try." "You were very brave," Isabella said softly. Rachel shrugged. "Emma was my friend, and Rosie was her friend too. We couldn't let an innocent man die." As if understanding the conversation, Rosie bobbed her head and repeated, "Innocent man, help Patrick." Isabella's phone buzzed with a message from Judge Pierce. "Robert Richardson in custody. Bringing him in for questioning. Keep the girl and the parrot there." "Looks like you and Rosie might need to stay a little longer," Isabella told Rachel. "They've found Robert Richardson." Rachel nodded solemnly. "Rosie has more to say," she said. "I can tell. She gets this look when she's remembering something important." At the police station, Robert Richardson sat in the interrogation room, his expensive clothes rumpled, his normally well-groomed hair disheveled. He had refused to speak without his lawyer present, a right that Judge Pierce insisted be respected, despite the sheriff's impatience. Nelson Grant, Robert's attorney, arrived within the hour, his expression tightly controlled as he was briefed on the situation. "This is outrageous," he declared, straightening his designer tie. "You've detained my client based on the vocalizations of a bird and the questionable testimony of a delivery man who conveniently remembered details months after the fact. Your client fled town immediately after the execution was stayed," Sheriff Jackson pointed out. "That doesn't suggest innocence. It suggests a young man distraught over his sister's murder and the emotion of the day," Nelson countered smoothly. "Robert has cooperated fully throughout this investigation. He was a key witness for the prosecution, if you recall." Judge Pierce, who had been silently observing, finally spoke. "Yes, he was. His testimony about Patrick and Emma's hostile relationship was particularly damning. But what if that testimony was designed to direct suspicion away from himself?" Nelson's smile was cold. "You're speculating, Your Honor, and in doing so you're causing additional trauma to a family that has already lost a daughter. Unless you have concrete evidence against my client, I suggest you release him immediately." Before Judge Pierce could respond, the door to the observation room opened, and Isabella entered, her expression urgent. "Your Honor, I need to speak with you," she said quietly. Excusing himself, Judge Pierce stepped outside. "What is it, Isabella?" "The forensic team just reported back on Emma's clothing from the night of the murder," she said, her voice low. "They found fibers consistent with the red jacket Robert was known to wear. Fibers that weren't documented in the original investigation." Judge Pierce's pulse quickened. "Were they deliberately overlooked?" Isabella nodded grimly. "It appears so. The lab technician who processed the evidence has admitted that he received a substantial payment to focus on certain aspects and not others. He claims he didn't know it would lead to charging the wrong person." "Who paid him?" "He says it was an anonymous cash transfer, but he strongly implied it came from within the Richardson family." Judge Pierce closed his eyes briefly, absorbing this new information. The case against Robert was growing stronger by the minute, but it also pointed to a more disturbing possibility: corruption within the justice system itself. "Bring the technician in," he ordered. "I want his full statement on record, and prepare a warrant to search Robert's residence specifically for that red jacket." When he returned to the interrogation room, Nelson was in the midst of a heated argument with Sheriff Jackson. "Enough," Judge Pierce said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Mr. Grant, your client is now facing serious questions about evidence tampering in addition to the new witnesses in his sister's murder." Robert, who had been slumped in his chair, suddenly straightened. "What new evidence? What witnesses?" Nelson placed a warning hand on his client's arm, but Robert shook it off. "I want to know what you think you have on me," he demanded, his voice cracking with stress. Judge Pierce studied him carefully. "We have a witness who saw someone matching your description leaving Emma's home the night she was killed. We have forensic evidence linking fibers from your red jacket to the crime scene, evidence that was deliberately suppressed. And we have Emma's parrot, which has been repeating phrases that strongly suggest you were present during the attack." Robert's face, already pale, turned ashen. "A parrot? You're basing this on a parrot?" "Among other things, yes," Judge Pierce confirmed. For a moment, the room was silent save for the ticking of the wall clock. Then, to everyone's surprise, Robert began to laugh, a high, strained sound that bordered on hysteria. "This is a nightmare," he gasped between laughs. "My life is being destroyed because of a bird." Nelson leaned in to whisper urgently in his client's ear, but Robert pushed him away. "No," he said, suddenly calm. "I want to see this parrot. I want to hear exactly what it's saying about me." Judge Pierce considered the request. It was unusual, but then again, everything about this case had become unusual the moment Rosie had interrupted the execution. "That can be arranged," he said finally, "but understand that anything the parrot says and your reaction to it will be documented." Robert nodded, his expression unreadable. "Fine, let's get this over with." As they prepared to bring Rosie to the interrogation room, none of them could have anticipated how this confrontation would break the case wide open, or the shocking confession it would ultimately provoke. The interrogation room had never felt smaller than it did when Rachel entered with Rosie's cage, escorted by Isabella. Judge Pierce, Sheriff Jackson, and Nelson Grant stood against one wall, while Robert Richardson sat rigidly at the table, his eyes fixed on the covered cage. "Rachel," Judge Pierce said gently, "would you please uncover Rosie's cage and see if she responds to Robert's presence?" Rachel nodded solemnly and removed the cloth cover. Rosie blinked in the sudden light, her head swiveling as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. When her beady eyes landed on Robert, she became instantly agitated, flapping her wings and hopping from perch to perch. "Red jacket," she squawked. "Stop, Robert. No hurt, Emma." Robert's face drained of all color. His hands, resting on the table, began to shake visibly. Rosie continued, her voice shifting in tone and cadence as if replaying a recorded conversation. "Robert, what are you doing here? Put that down. No, please, help." The room fell into stunned silence. The parrot's mimicry of Emma's voice, for it was unmistakably an attempt to reproduce Emma's speech patterns, was chillingly accurate. Even Nelson Grant seemed momentarily at a loss for words. "That proves nothing," Robert finally said, but his voice lacked conviction. "She's just a bird repeating random phrases." Sheriff Jackson leaned forward. "Random phrases that happen to describe your sister's murder?" "Your Honor," Nelson interjected, regaining his composure, "surely you can't consider this as legitimate evidence. There's no way to verify where or when this bird heard these phrases." "You're right," Judge Pierce acknowledged. "Alone, the parrot's vocalizations wouldn't constitute admissible evidence. But combined with the witness statement, placing someone matching Robert's description at the scene, and the forensic evidence linking fibers from his red jacket to Emma's clothing, they form a compelling narrative." Robert's eyes darted between the judge, the sheriff, and the parrot. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the room's cool temperature. "I want to speak with my client privately," Nelson demanded. "Of course," Judge Pierce agreed. "Rachel, please take Rosie back to my chambers for now." As Rachel gathered the cage, Rosie made one final declaration. "Money in box, money for knife." Robert jerked as if physically struck. Nelson quickly guided him from the room, shooting a warning glance at Sheriff Jackson, who had started forward at the parrot's words. Once alone in a consultation room, Nelson confronted his client. "Robert, what was the bird talking about? What money? What box?" Robert paced the small room, running his hands through his hair. "This is insane. I'm being accused by a parrot. A parrot." "Robert," Nelson said firmly, "I need you to focus. There's more evidence against you than just the bird. If there's something you haven't told me, now is the time." Robert stopped pacing and sank into a chair, his face buried in his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed and desperate. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," he whispered. "She wasn't supposed to be home." Nelson's professional mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing shock before he quickly composed himself. "I think you'd better tell me everything." Meanwhile, Judge Pierce had instructed Sheriff Jackson to obtain a search warrant for Robert's residence, with specific instructions to look for a red jacket and any boxes that might contain money or evidence related to the murder weapon. Isabella approached the judge as they waited. "Your Honor, there's something else you should know. I've been reviewing the financial records from the original investigation." The lab technician wasn't the only one who received unexplained payments around the time of Emma's murder. Who else? Judge Pierce asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew the answer. Detective Wilson, the lead investigator, deposited a large sum in an offshore account 3 days after Patrick's arrest, and there were calls between his phone and Robert Richardson's in the hours immediately following Emma's death. Judge Pierce closed his eyes briefly, absorbing this new information. Contact the district attorney. We need to expand this investigation to include possible obstruction of justice and corruption. Within the hour, Sheriff Jackson returned from Robert's residence, his expression grim but satisfied. We found the jacket hidden in a crawl space, he reported, and this was in a safe behind his bookshelf. He placed an evidence bag on the table. Inside was a small wooden box containing stacks of cash and a handwritten note with detailed instructions for disposing of a knife in the lake outside town, the same lake where Patrick's knife had allegedly been found. There's more, Jackson continued. We found correspondences between Robert and Detective Wilson discussing how to ensure Patrick would be the prime suspect. Robert was apparently leveraging an old gambling debt Wilson had to force his cooperation. Judge Pierce's jaw tightened. Where is Detective Wilson now? We've detained him for questioning. He's already looking to make a deal. When Nelson Grant emerged from the consultation room, his usual confident demeanor was subdued. Judge Pierce, my client would like to make a statement. The formal confession took place in the courtroom, the same space where Patrick had been wrongfully convicted. Robert Richardson, no longer the poised businessman, but a broken man, stood before Judge Pierce and admitted to the premeditated murder of his sister. I never meant for Patrick to die, he said, his voice hollow. I just needed someone to take the blame. Emma was going to ruin everything when she took control of the company. She had found evidence of my embezzlement and threatened to expose me. I went to confront her, things escalated, and... He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The truth had finally emerged, clear and devastating. After securing Robert's confession, Judge Pierce moved quickly to address the miscarriage of justice. Patrick Evanston was formally exonerated, all charges against him dismissed with prejudice. The corruption that had tainted the original investigation was exposed, with Detective Wilson and the lab technician facing charges alongside Robert. Martha and George Richardson, shattered by the revelation of their son's guilt, established a foundation in Emma's name dedicated to preventing wrongful convictions. It was a small attempt at atonement for the role their family's influence had unwittingly played in nearly executing an innocent man. 2 weeks after the dramatic interruption of the execution, Judge Pierce sat in his chambers, the weight of recent events still heavy on his mind. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called. Patrick Evanston entered, no longer bearing the haunted look of a condemned man. Freedom had already begun to restore him, though the experience had left visible marks in the premature grey at his temples and the wariness in his eyes. "Thank you for seeing me, Your Honor," Patrick said, taking the offered seat. "I think, under the circumstances, you can call me Harold," Judge Pierce replied. "How are you adjusting?" Patrick managed a small smile. "One day at a time. The settlement from the state will help me restart my life, though no amount of money can give back the years I lost." He paused. "I didn't come here for that, though. I came to thank you." Judge Pierce's brow furrowed. "Thank me?" "Patrick, I sentenced you to death for a crime you didn't commit. If anyone should be asking for forgiveness, it's me." "But when the truth presented itself, you listened," Patrick said simply. "Not everyone would have stopped an execution for a Parrot's testimony. Your willingness to reconsider, to question your own judgment, that saved my life as surely as Rosie's intervention." Before Judge Pierce could respond, there was another knock, and Rachel entered with Rosie's cage. "Sorry to interrupt," she said. "I just wanted to let you know that the Richardsons' lawyer called. They've formally transferred ownership of Rosie to me, like we discussed." Judge Pierce nodded. "That's good news. How is she settling in with you?" "Perfectly," Rachel beamed. "My parents said she can stay in my room, and she's already learned the names of everyone in our family." As if to demonstrate, Rosie bobbed her head and chirped, "Rachel good. Rachel friend." Patrick laughed. a genuine warm sound that seemed to surprise even him. "The witness of the century," he said, approaching the cage. "Hello there, Rosie. I don't think I properly thanked you either." Rosie tilted her head, studying Patrick with intelligent eyes. Then, to everyone's amazement, she said clearly, "Patrick innocent. Patrick free." The simple phrase brought unexpected tears to Judge Pierce's eyes. In his long career, he had always believed that justice was a human endeavor, governed by human laws and human judgment. Yet here was a bird, a creature outside their legal system entirely, who had managed to reveal a truth that all their careful procedures had missed. "I've been thinking a lot about our justice system," Judge Pierce said, collecting himself, "about how easily it can be corrupted, how quickly we accept circumstantial evidence when it fits a convenient narrative. Your case has changed me, Patrick, and it's going to change how I approach every case that comes before me from now on." Patrick nodded thoughtfully. "The system isn't perfect because people aren't perfect. But what matters is our willingness to correct our mistakes when they're discovered. Even when that discovery comes from unexpected sources," Rachel added, smiling at Rosie. Judge Pierce rose from his desk and extended his hand to Patrick. "I can never fully make amends for what happened to you, but I can promise that your experience will not be in vain. We're instituting new safeguards, more rigorous standards for evidence, better oversight of investigations. Your case will be taught in law schools as a caution against confirmation bias and corrupted process." Patrick accepted the handshake. "That's all I can ask for. That, and perhaps a chance to work with your reforms. I have a unique perspective, after all." "I think that could be arranged," Judge Pierce said with genuine warmth. As Patrick and Rachel left with Rosie, Judge Pierce returned to the window of his chambers. Outside, the town continued its rhythms, unaware of how close it had come to a terrible injustice. The execution platform had been dismantled, the crowd long dispersed. In their place was an ordinary day, sunlight spilling across the courthouse steps where, weeks earlier, a Parrot's unexpected testimony had changed everything. Judge Pierce had always believed in the weight of human testimony, in the power of sworn oaths and carefully examined evidence. Now he understood that truth could come from anywhere, even from the simplest of creatures, speaking without agenda or pretense. He opened his desk drawer and removed the commendation he had prepared. It read, "To Rosie, whose voice revealed the truth when all human voices failed." It was perhaps the strangest official document he had ever signed, but also, he thought, one of the most important. In a world of human complexities and corruptions, sometimes the purest testimony came from those who simply repeated what they heard, without interpretation, without bias. From the mouths of birds, the truth had finally set an innocent man free, and Judge Harold Pierce, humbled by this realization, vowed never to forget its lesson. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the world of captivating stories. I trust you found today's narrative as engaging as I did. If you enjoyed this exploration into fascinating and compelling narratives, kindly indicate your appreciation by liking this video. Are you watching on mobile? Show your appreciation with a double tap for hype. For more captivating stories and journeys into the heart of compelling storytelling, please subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you don't miss a single upload. Your thoughts and interpretations are most welcome. Please share your perspectives on today's story in the comments below. And if you believe others would find this content engaging, please consider sharing the video with your network. Until our next journey into the world of captivating tales, I bid you farewell.